Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Sound on Screen podcast. My name is Matt Lawson.
My name's Liane Silva.
And today we are discussing the Leitmotif.
Yeah, so it's such a, I feel like this is such a huge topic. Every time you say leitmotif, there's such a rich tradition, a rich history within music composition, but also within film music composition or screen music composition, I should say, actually. So, yeah, I mean, I guess today we're going to be talking mostly about two major composers, I suppose. But just to get us started, Matt, what are your thoughts on sort of the essential nature, I'm going to call it, of the leitmotif? Do you think it's essential in order to bring out, the best of a character or the best of a story? Or do you think it's old-fashioned? Or is it both? Can it be both in different situations, and why?
Yeah, so just to quickly define what the leitmotif is, I'm sure most people listening will already know, but it's a recurrent musical theme in a musical work associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. So in film music, it's usually your character theme. It can be used to define an object as well, or a location. So films like Lord of the Rings, there's a leitmotif for the One Ring itself, for the Shire, for Mordor. So, but in terms of the leitmotif in film, essential or old-fashioned? So I think the strength of a leitmotif is that it creates an immediately memorable musical identity for a character. Most people that go to watch films may not be music specialists. So when music is used in film, it has to be there to make an immediate impact on people that might not have a deep level of music education. So what that means is that a musical theme for a character has to be memorable. It has to be musically quite simple in order for people to memorize it. And that's the real strength of it. So in its most basic term, you've got a character who has a character theme. When you first see that character, you hear their theme. Every time they're on screen, you hear that musical theme. And if it's a 2, 3, 4, 5-part film series, by film 2, you know that when you hear that music, it's representing that character. It gives a clear kind of a sonic signature to that character on screen. Of course, it was championed long before film music by Richard Wagner, the German composer, who used it extensively in his operas. So the epic Ring cycle had hundreds of leitmotifs linked to characters, objects, locations, and film music very much took up the mantle from Wagner long after his death. In terms of it being old-fashioned, I mean, it kind of, in the golden age of Hollywood, the leitmotif was a really common way of scoring, but then it went out of fashion in the 1950s, 1960s, when film music went through a lot of changes. And it was John Williams really that brought it back with primarily with Star Wars. And for Star Wars, for a multi-film franchise like Star Wars that has, it's set in a sci-fi fictional universe across dozens of planets with unfamiliar aliens and creatures and locations, the music is a real anchor point for the audience in understanding these different characters, locations, and so forth. But that was the 1970s, and in terms of, I think films can over rely on leitmotifs. I think if you start to notice the character's theme consciously, then it's being overused, or it's not quite being used in the right way. I think it's not subtle. The leitmotif is not a subtle film music technique, and I think that in recent years there's been more of a trend to move towards more sound design or soundscape-driven scores that don't really lend themselves to the use of a leitmotif. So I think that it's very much a case of pros and cons. I think if you want the audience to understand who a character is, or to relate to a character quickly, they're fantastic. In terms of where the trend in film music is going, I think we're starting to see a bit of a decline, and maybe the notion that they're becoming slightly old-fashioned.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of really interesting things there, and I think I would like to pick up on a couple of them. The first one is, you mentioned the word, or you described it as, it has to be a relatively simple melody, because of course otherwise we wouldn't be able to sing it, we wouldn't be able to just it wouldn't have that sort of earworm kind of quality to it. But I also think, then you mentioned John Williams, who is of course the master of hiding complexity within simplicity. And I guess what I mean by this, it's always fascinating that, as you said, we can sing. Anyone that has ever seen a John Williams film will be coming out at the end of it, coming out of the theatre, and they know the tune. You might not know it by heart. You might not know, what instrument is playing, what's going on, but you know the tune.
Yeah, and that's the simplest example, of course. Back in episode 2, Jaws, 2 notes. That's
Exactly.
one of the
Yeah.
most simple motifs. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's also a sort of a real infrastructure, I want to call it, a real complexity that goes underneath all of that, and which is why I say he sort of hides complexity. It's not really hidden, but it's somewhat hidden beneath or behind that simplicity of the leitmotif that he sort of comes up with. And it's quite interesting, considering perhaps that there's this trend that you mentioned of the leitmotif going away. I do seem to think that it might be going away in some cases, but I also think it might be changing. And the very concept of leitmotif as being solely melodic, solely resting on the most, I don't want to call it the most purely musical aspect, but I guess the music composition in itself as an exercise of only composing the notes, if that makes sense, I think is disappearing somewhat. And it might have to do with technology, it might have to do with just cultural trends. I think it's such a huge undertaking to try and understand and to try and determine one single factor that interferes with this or influences this. But I do also think it's quite interesting, considering cases like Hans Zimmer, where the leitmotif is used, but to an even more simplified extent. But then there's a different kind of infrastructure supporting it. There's a different complexity, almost, sonic in the sense of sound design, or textural in the sense as well of sound design and instrument selection. What are your thoughts on that? How do you think that affects, in terms of the storytelling? Do you think that both approaches could be used differently or in the same way? Do you see a way of conjoining as well the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's that big question, whether the leitmotif is kind of quite a deep storytelling tool, a sophisticated storytelling tool, or whether it's kind of a cheap musical shortcut for audiences, and it's could almost be considered quite patronizing to audiences, that they need a character to have like their own little musical theme tune in order to understand them. I agree with the points on, I think the more leitmotifs, the effectiveness of a leitmotif, in my opinion, isn't the initial statement of it. It's what you then do with that leitmotif as the character's narrative arc develops. So, I mean, again, forgive me for talking about John Williams and Star Wars all the time,
No,
but
go for it. Yeah, we're all
by far the best example, by far the best example I use in my teaching as well is the Anakin Skywalker Darth Vader character arc, because the way Williams adapts the Imperial March is just it's genius. And I think I might have mentioned this in episode 1, where you go from kind of a subtle foreshadowing of the Imperial March when Anakin Skywalker is a young boy, and it's in a major key, and then you get to the fall of Anakin to become Darth Vader. You get this big militaristic march rendition with full orchestra and powerful brass, and it's it's really kind of in your face, pin you back in your seat kind of music. And then you get Darth Vader's death and redemption, where the melody of the Imperial March is reduced to a solo French horn, a solo flute, and then a solo harp, which is the most delicate instrument in the orchestra. So it's not about the notes on the page that define the melody. It's about what you then do with that melody, what you do with the harmony, the orchestration as the narrative evolves. And that's when it becomes a more sophisticated musical subtext. And even for audiences that may have no musical background, I think they pick up on that. I've spoken to people who are huge Star Wars fans that, by their own admission, don't really have a lot of musical bones in their body. but they have
Yeah.
mentioned how powerful they found that Imperial March leitmotif when it was reduced to more subtle, delicate instruments.
Mm,
They understood what that was trying to say musically.
mm,
Um, so yeah, I think there's a big difference here between talking about a leitmotif as a copy and paste
mm.
melodic line
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
a deeper kind of storytelling tool that adapts and adopts different ways of representing
Mm.
itself as a character or a narrative develops.
I mean, I suppose it also has to do with I guess we're talking a little bit about the evolution of the creative industries, I suppose, aren't we? Because it also has to do with, a certain composer creates this massive, really unique, really um, complex score, and then you have God knows how many people in God knows how many film studios, just going, yeah, we're not gonna, we can't afford John Williams, so we're gonna hire you as the composer. Can you recreate this without obviously plagiarizing and getting some sort of copyright lawsuit or something. Um, so there's also that element, which is for every single I guess for every single score or for every single composition that is truly groundbreaking or truly influential, I mean, God knows how many you then have that are just trying to replicate that, but sort of fail to see the bigger picture as well as the details that made it actually unique in the first place and groundbreaking in the first place. Which is, I guess, it's quite interesting to think about because it also brings out that sort of question of uh, you know, being a composer and having your own unique voice as a creative versus you have to give uh, sort of priority to the voices of the project directors or the studio executive, whoever it is that's sort of hiring you. And where do you draw the line? Where do you sort of you know draw that line and decide, no, I'm going to stand my ground versus I need the job. I'm not going to get fired or anything. This is the job, so let's just do the job, kind of thing. um
Yeah, and it kind of links in as well to this. Films have to be films are the film industry is a business, right? If you're making a film, you want it to make money, and we can argue about the issues of art being commercialized and all that. That's a whole other discussion. But ultimately, a film studio will only make a film if they think it can turn a profit, which is simple business sense.
yeah.
And the music is a big part of any film. We've established that. I mean, the entire reason this podcast exists and we're film and video game and TV music scholars is that it's an important part of the package. So going back to kind of is the leitmotif a kind of cheap musical shortcut? Well, in some ways, yes, but also it kind of has to be. Like that's what audiences expect. The film industry has to make their films accessible to the widest number of people in order to sell tickets and
Exactly.
um,
Yeah.
sell DVDs. But we seem to be moving into the age where that's not really a thing anymore. It's more about streaming. But um,
Yeah.
it's like universality versus cultural specificity as well. So if you're creating a film in Hollywood, you're going to have to create something that's musically understandable, recognizable
Mm.
across the world, like in a global context. So I think there's a real case here to be made for. We can look at it two ways, really, because if you've got a leitmotif that's very much grounded in kind of the Western music tradition and is very kind of Americanized or Hollywoodized, then maybe that's not going to have as much resonance in
Mm.
Indonesia or Nigeria or, I'm just picking countries off the top of my head now, or Brazil. But likewise, the the understanding will be there that with Darth Vader, that music is in a minor key, so it sounds evil. And I would think that even though different countries and parts of the world might have different understandings of modality and tonality,
Mm.
that kind of militaristic aggression would still be not universally understood, but universally recognized as what that music is trying to do for that character. If you move into that world of atmosphere and sound worlds, I feel that kind of clouds things a little bit more because some countries or some parts of the world's understanding of how harmony works and scales work, and might not quite align with what Hollywood are trying to do. So ultimately, a lot of these decisions do come down to the studio, the location the film's made in, and how comfortable they are in creating something that's meant to be consumed outside of the Western hemisphere.
Yeah.
And you would never expect that a leitmotif would be a consideration in these things, but it has to be, because the more specific you make it to be understood by a American, Canadian, British, Western European audience, the more you're alienating the rest of the world and potentially losing viewers because they don't understand what the music's trying to do. I know the music isn't the key thing in the film. You've got acting, you've got dialogue, you've got lighting, and what I don't want to be guilty of here is overstating the impact of music in a film. But these are all considerations that if you're using, let's face it, the leitmotif is heavily rooted in late Romantic European tradition, Wagner, and that's kind of persisted. So it's using the leitmotif is in some ways reinforcing the Hollywood-centric nature of film in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And that's quite an uncomfortable thing to juggle, because at the same time it's an effective music technique. So again,
it works.
where are the concessions that you make here in terms of, do you lose a well-established composition technique to be more inclusive to a global audience, or do you keep doing what you're doing but potentially be accused of keeping film too based in the Western Hemisphere?
Yeah, I mean that touches as well on because it's a bit of a cycle, isn't it? I mean, the fact that so much of Western cinema nowadays is, as you said, pretty much Hollywood centric. First of all, Western centric, but also Hollywood centric specifically, I guess. It's almost a little bit of a self-affirming cycle, isn't it? Because so much of specifically North American culture has been, I want to use the word exported, maybe, even though I don't know if that's the correct word, but I guess that's the concept I'm trying to get at. So much of North American culture in specific has been exported, especially in a post World War II context, into Europe. That, as you said, even though it does have its roots in Wagnerian practices and traditions, it also has mutated. Also, not sure if that's the right word, but I guess it has mutated into this very specific, this is the Hollywood formula almost, or this is the Hollywood approach. And there's so many aspects of North American culture that we just take for granted almost within European culture in and of itself, if that makes sense. Cinema included. These franchises that we're talking about, I mean, not just these, but I guess other franchises as well, they have such a degree of success, obviously some more than others, but they do have such a degree of success that all of these business models as well that we've mentioned, so the streaming model, I guess it's not DVDs anymore, as you said, or Blu-rays or whatever, but it's streaming nowadays, isn't it? There's a reason why it's successful. There's a reason why we both recognize its effectiveness, but also that it keeps on being effective, and therefore a lot of composers keep using it, a lot of studios keep using it, or sort of wanting it to be used in their productions, and it just keeps looping in itself, I guess, sort of reinforcing these strategies, and as you said, I guess somehow drifting away from multiculturality in order to sacrificing that a little bit in order to just make it work, make it sell, kind of thing. Yeah,
I agree. And I think we're in an interesting time at the minute with film, and I'm going to include TV at this point as well, because we're in an era of high budget, like peak TV, where you get $1 million episodes of shows. And I do get the sense that there is more and more of an expectation that filmmakers kind of are rejecting the notion that they need to tell the audience what to feel. And the leitmotif is the biggest culprit in telling an audience how to feel. You're literally saying, sad violin music, you've got to feel sad now. And so I just wonder, are we seeing the death of the leitmotif? Do you believe that it will persist long into the future? We've spoken at length already about how effective it is as a label for characters, objects, locations, whatever, and that it creates that really strong link for the audience between something sonic and something they can see on screen. But as we move towards an age where I'd like to say that filmmakers and studios are giving audiences more autonomy of their feelings and their thoughts and their reactions to film.
Absolutely.
Has the leitmotif got a place or a role to play still as we move deeper into the 21st century, or do you think that it's very much on borrowed time in terms of being a kind of long-lasting film music technique?
I mean, I think that it does have a place. I think, as I said, maybe an evolution of what it means, and in the practice of actual, music composition practice, what does it mean for each composer? How can each composer find a way to? I mean, essentially, what we're getting at is this representational function of music. Whether it's representing the shark in Jaws or Darth Vader in Star Wars, as you were saying. That's ultimately what we're getting at. And I don't think that that's going to be lost. It might lose its appeal for a little bit, but I think it's going to happen. What's going to happen is going to be similar to what we've been witnessing, for example, within popular music, where the 80s are sort of making a comeback. So it's sort of a cyclical nature in all of this, isn't it? We're going to get tired of it maybe for a little while, and then we're going to bring it back in some sort of nostalgic kind of way. But I do think I don't think it will die, so to speak. I think it will. I think it has already changed. First of all, I think it will continue changing, and I actually find it a really interesting exercise. Just for myself personally, an exercise in music composition, just actually trying to brainstorm ways of how can I still write a melody that fulfills the function of the leitmotif, but how can I do it differently? Are there ways of doing it differently? Can I maybe hint at a certain emotional beat that isn't necessarily oh, this sad thing happened with this character, so as you said, sad violin music. Can I do it some other way, shape, or form? And I think that's what I'm excited about, to be honest. I'm really excited with these sorts of brainstorming ideas where we think, oh yes, this has always been done. How can we do it differently? And why does that difference matter? How can we make it matter? I'm not saying, do it differently just for the sake of being different, but just trying to innovate as well. And I certainly do think that there have been, and there are composers that, that do that. So yeah, I'm quite excited actually to see where things keep progressing. Especially to do with these blends, the so-called hybrid scores that are quite popular nowadays, this sort of blend between orchestral and synthesized instrumentations. And I do think that opens up certain possibilities, especially for composers that, might not have access to a huge orchestra, that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think it will die. I don't think...
No.
I don't think you can have certain characters. First of all, I don't think you can have certain characters or certain types of stories without, this character's on screen, here's him. Yeah. I don't think that feeling of watching that as an audience member will get old. Generally, I don't. But I do think, maybe it will change. It will just keep evolving and adapting. We will keep changing the definition of what leitmotif actually means for us as composers, for the audience as well. Maybe they view things differently. Maybe someone that would have seen, Star Wars and back when the first films came out, versus, I guess, more recent adaptations of it. I'm thinking as well of, I'm trying to remember. It's like in the tip of my tongue. This like spin-off Star Wars show, Andor, I think is the name of
Andor,
it, which is quite a different approach, both narratively, but somewhat as well, musically. And I don't necessarily see it as less or more valid. I just think it's quite an interesting take on that world in particular, just because we've been talking about it.
Just kind of a final point on leitmotifs, and before we wrap up episode 3, I think it's really important to mention the genre specificity of leitmotifs.
Absolutely, yes.
Um, so I think, particularly, we've mentioned Star Wars, or I mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier. I think science fiction and fantasy are the most well-suited genres for leitmotifs, because one thing I try and explain to my students is if you've got an unfamiliar world, whether that's Middle Earth, whether it's a Star Wars universe, you've got unfamiliar concepts like the Force or this one ring that's evil. You've got unfamiliar characters and races and all the other kind of things you get in sci-fi and fantasy.
Mhm.
Audiences need something that grounds them in our world in order to understand what's happening. So
Yeah.
let's take Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, and you've got the Shire where you've got these kind of 3 foot tall, very hairy little cute creatures living in holes underground, and you've got them in this world that you don't understand. But then we hear music that draws on kind of British or Celtic folk songs. You think, oh, hold on, this is meant to represent a kind of Middle Earth version of the UK or Ireland, and you think,
Yeah.
okay, I understand a bit more now. Likewise, in Star Wars, you've got these planets that are covered in sprawling cities inhabited by aliens, and you've got people using the Force to throw things around. You've got people with lightsabers and people with 3 heads, but then you hear some like heroic brass in the trumpet, heroic trumpets playing a fanfare. That's a real world, that's an our world signifier that helps us to understand what's happening on screen. So it's a type of world building. But I think
Absolutely, yeah.
if you also had some really wacky, unfamiliar music, that's too much unfamiliarity for an audience, and they wouldn't truly understand what was happening. So I think music and leitmotifs are one way you can really ground an audience in our world in order to understand the fictional world, whether that's sci-fi or fantasy.
I mean, I guess just picking up on what you said about unfamiliarity, do you think that? Because I'm just thinking back to for something, for example, like the current adaptations that have been made for Dune, um, by Denis Villeneuve, and the score is Hans Zimmer as well, which is there's this sort of, I don't know if I want to call it a leitmotif, because it doesn't necessarily appear when one single character is on screen, and it's more attached to a certain thread of the narrative and the world of Dune. But the whole sort of, I don't know what to call it. I guess the belted singing, and the theme, the music theme. Sorry, I should specify that the singer sings in that particular cue, and it's really interesting because in that particular cinematic world, as well as in the world of the books, I would argue unfamiliarity is very much part of it. So I guess the intention would be perhaps, to make you, as the audience member, to make you feel like you are, you don't know where you are, you don't know what this is, and you feel um, uncomfortable. You feel like it's an unfamiliar world, and maybe that's precisely the narrative point. So I guess my last question would be, um, do you also think that there's a deeper connection there to be made in terms of precisely what we've been saying, in terms of the leitmotif advancing and evolving as a concept and as a practical sort of approach, but also, does it connect more deeply perhaps with the narrative at hand? So not just the genre, but also what is the actual mood and vibe that is trying to be communicated?
Yeah, I think that's the next natural step for leitmotifs to take. I think for I'm not going to say for too long, because it's a well established and it's a successful compositional technique, but we're really grounded to this idea of a leitmotif having to represent a character or an object, and it's quite rigid in that respect. So I think if we have recurring musical themes that are aligned to more abstract concepts and narrative subplots, that you can still make that tangible link, but it's not something that's maybe as explicit as when the theme is attached to a character or an object. I think that's taken the leitmotif to an advanced level where the audience will recognize that this particular musical theme keeps reoccurring, but then it's kind of up to them to figure out which part of the film's construct it's attaching itself to. So June's a really good example because you do get these recurring musical kind of snippets or cues that keep coming back, but at first glance, there's not anything kind of tangible that also reoccurs when the music comes back. So it kind of it removes itself from being attached to something explicit, and it's a more, like I say, it's a more abstract idea. So I think, you know, I think the definition of the leitmotif can start to adapt as film composers start to realize they can do more with a leitmotif than simply attach it to something, and it can have more freedom to operate within the film's running time, and to detach itself from this really kind of codependent relationship that it's got when it's a leitmotif for a character. So yeah, I think again you could then ask the question: is it then still a leitmotif, or is it just a recurring musical theme? But I would argue that by definition, if it's a recurring musical theme, it's a leitmotif because it keeps coming back for a reason. And just because it might not be immediately kind of, you might not immediately be able to conceive what it's attached to, it still keeps coming back for a reason, which the audience can try and figure out for themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, this is such a fascinating discussion. I feel like we could go on for hours and hours and hours just talking, you know, picking different examples and just figuring out you know, how did this composer approach it, and how is it different, how is it the same, why does it work, why does it not, etc. But yeah, I guess you know, this has been our episode 3, talking a little bit about leitmotif, bringing a little bit of that discussion as well, you know, Williams versus Zimmer. I really like that, not in a adversarial kind of way, but just I really think those are two composers that really inspire me for so many different reasons, and I think they inspire so many people. And you know, just trying to understand you know, what are their strengths, and what each of them does that's different, but you know, still contributes. So yeah, I think
Great. I think a Williams versus Zimmer episode is definitely in the pipeline because there's a bit of a kind of light-hearted what's what I'm looking for, rivalry going on there, and of course there's the Williams versus Zimmer concert series that's touring the UK at the minute and Europe as well. So yes, that was episode 3 on leitmotifs. Thank you very much for listening, and so it's goodbye from me,
and goodbye from me.
see you in the next episode.